We're going to use the same example that we just used in the last video, the local example.py. And in this PY file, we saw that they had a letter grade function that had a parameter called itotal. We also saw that there was a variable in the main program called itotal, and we confirmed that they were different. And the reason we confirmed that is because we saw that if we changed itotal in the function, when we came back to the main program, it still had its original value. And that's because we found that parameters are local variables, meaning they're local to the function. They're not visible outside. So if this variable was called iStuff, and I changed all this to be the ever popular iStuff variable, if I tried to come over here and print iStuff, let's see what would happen. First of all, the red lines says it doesn't even understand who it is. So even though you call the function before you try to print it, the iStuff variable only lives in this function. Once the function's over, the variable's gone, memory collects it back on the shelf, loses its value, it doesn't exist anymore. So what if we want to actually work with the variable in our main program and in our function? Let's try something. Let's go ahead and get rid of the parameter. Now that I've got rid of the parameter, I do have a variable called itotal here. We'll get rid of that parameter. So now it says we're just going to call the letter grade function. And in the letter grade function, we're going to use the variable itotal. Now maybe that's the same variable. Let's see. We're going to go ahead and run this. And lo and behold, it prints A and the value of 92. Now how did that happen? The variable itotal was declared in the main program. In the letter grade function, it used itotal, but the difference was we did not declare it as a parameter. Meaning, since there was not a naming conflict to where there was more than one itotal variable, Python says, oh, you must be a variable from outside of my function. And so it goes out and says, do you exist itotal? And it says, yep, right here. And so it says, oh, well, that should be the same. At least that's what we think, because it did work. Well, what if I came into this function and I said itotal was equal to 0? Remember how we wanted to reset the variable? I'm going to save it, and instantly, look what happens. It says, you're doing something with itotal before you even assigned it. So if I try to run it again, now I have an error, and it says you're trying to use a variable and you've never even assigned it a value. And that's because by me saying itotal is equal to 0, the function has now been modified, and the function is thinking, oh, we've got a new variable you just created called itotal, and it's equal to 0. Well, what if I delete that variable and put it back the way it was? Let's try to run it one more time. And now it works again. And so it looks like if I don't modify the contents, it just tries to find the variable that's out there and uses it. Now that seems a little scary and sort of hard to debug. And a way that we can get around that and make sure we know what we're really doing is through the use of something called a global variable. Remember, our local variables are only visible inside the function. They're not visible outside of it. The global variable says it can go wherever it wants as long as we've identified it as a global variable. And the way I do that is I come into my function, I type in the word global, and I specify whatever variable I want to be global. Meaning the system knows that this variable was defined somewhere else. And so if I ever try to work with it by changing a value, I'm not creating a brand new variable. I'm using the same variable that was declared somewhere else. So let's try this now and see if we still have our error. It says we have an error. Let's see what happens. Let's save it and run it. And now it works. And so even though this is saying we have an error, we really don't have an error. We said iTotal was equal to 0. Call that function, change iTotal to 0, and print iTotal, which printed to 0. So this is no longer a local variable. This is a global variable. One thing you cannot do is declare a variable as a global and then try to initialize it at the same time. If I try to run this, we have an error. It says you can't initialize that global variable. You have to define it first, and then you can use it. And that's how you can make a global variable. All you have to do is specify the word global. Now, what if I did this instead? What if I left that off, and then I came down here and said global iTotal, and then assigned the value of 92 to iTotal. The system still says you can't use that variable. So when you go to use a global variable inside of a function, that's where you have to define the global variable. Defining it out in the main program doesn't help. You have to do it inside of the function. Another thing you might want to be aware of. What if we did this? What if I declared the variable iTotal at the very top, and then I tried to access that later on in the program? So I declared it at the top, I have my function, and here's the main program. Let's see what happens. Does it understand that it's a global variable now? Still doesn't understand. There's still a problem that it says you're using it before you've tried to declare it anywhere. And so it's not liking that. So that just goes to show that if you want to use a global variable, you need to declare that variable in the function. Don't try to assign it. You might still see an error message show up, but it actually works that now we've declared it as a global variable in the function. It's visible in the main program, it's visible in the function, and it can be changed in both places. So for every function you have, you would have to declare the variable global before you could start using it.